So good evening, everyone, and welcome to Where Do We Go From Here? What will US trade policy under Biden look like, and how will it be received for our friends and allies? Organized by the Washington Foreign Law Society. I'm Juliana Canet, the president of the Washington Foreign Law Society, founded in 1952 to promote knowledge and understanding of international legal matters, comparative legal issue, and foreign law. Given the number of participants, you would be muted during the webinar, but able to communicate with us via the Q&A session. Please send questions for our distinguished panelists using Q&A section on your screen, and we'll get to your question toward the end of the presentation. The session will be recorded. One final note before I hand the floor to Evelyn, please consider becoming a member of the Society. We have discount rate for students and government employees. I will put the link to the membership on the chat. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. Let me introduce our moderator for this evening, Ms. Evelyn Suarez. Evelyn is the founder of the Suarez Firm, PLLC, a boutique providing advice on costume and international trade matters. Welcome, Evelyn. The floor is yours.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers, Thomas Bart and Barbara Weisel, who will give us their perspectives on what U.S. trade policies might look like under a Biden administration and how such policies might be received by the rest of the world. But given their backgrounds, I want to clarify, we will focus on Europe and Asia. To tell you, I'm not going to read their bios because our time is limited, but I will tell you their current positions. Thomas is the head of Trade and Agriculture section at the EU delegation to the US, and Barbara is a managing partner at Rock Creek Global Advisors, and notably was the US chief trade negotiator for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. Needless to say, both have long and distinguished careers in trade. We're going to try our best to reserve 15 minutes for questions. So please, as Juliana just told you, submit your questions through the Q&A. Okay, so just want to set the table a little bit. At the end of 2020, Forbes senior contributor Stuart Anderson wrote a piece entitled "Trump Trade Policy Gets Failing Grades." He cited an analysis that found that Trump's policies of raising tariffs and misusing US trade laws harmed consumers, disrupted supply chains, and failed to achieve important US objectives. One of the first things that Trump did was pull out of TPP. He also discovered old laws, old tools like Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 and Trade Act, Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. He used the 232, which is a national security provision of law, to impose tariffs on steel and aluminum for virtually all steel and aluminum from around the world. He used Section 301 to investigate China's failure to protect IP and its forced technology transfer practices, which ultimately led to tariffs on most goods from China. As Trump promised, he also got rid of NAFTA, and he replaced it with a new agreement called USMCA. So let's get started with the discussion so you can hear from Thomas and Barbara. Please note that our guests are speaking in their personal capacities. Okay, let's start. Barbara and Thomas, what do you see as the opportunities and challenges for Asia and for Europe on trade with the United States? Any long-hanging fruit? Maybe we could start with Barbara this time. We're gonna mix it up, Barbara.
Well, thanks, Evelyn, and thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here this evening. I guess I would want to start by talking a bit about the Biden administration trade policy and how it differs from what you just described as the Trump trade policy. And it is early days, but this is going to be a different trade policy in some ways than the Trump trade policy, certainly in the perspective. I mean, it's early days and some of the positions have yet to be filled, and those will be important in determining the direction that things head. And policy in some areas remains unclear. But one thing that is clear from this administration is its priorities. And I think they've set those out very, very clearly from the beginning. It's COVID, 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 both the COVID recovery and economic, health, and on the economic side. It is tackling the economic crisis. It is maintaining U.S. technological leadership and addressing that China challenge. Those are the top priorities. The manner in which the administration has said it intends to do this is in part by revitalizing ties with allies and working much more closely with partners. So I would say, in terms of U.S. allies, certainly in Asia, they breathed, many of them, a collective sigh of relief that the U.S. was going to be engaging more actively with them, and that this shift in approach would lead to greater cooperation on a lot of the issues that they care about. But I think even for those Asian partners, and probably more broadly, they are still a bit cautious. Now they've moved quickly to work with the United States, but I think many of them are asking questions like, what does working with allies and partners mean? How does the U.S. intend to work with Asia? Is it all about China, or are there other areas on which the United States is looking to work with them? The United States is talking about taking a modular approach. So you've seen meetings that the United States has had with the Quad and with Japan, and there's meetings planned with the Korean president at the end of May. At the same time as there are discussions going on in the G7 and with the EU, and Thomas is going to talk about those. I think the question is, how are they linked? What does that mean for these countries? Is it hub and spoke? The United States is in the middle, or exactly how is all of this going to work? Another set of questions I think the Asians are asking is, what is trade policy for the middle class? So does that mean that the 232 and the 301 tariffs that were put in place by the Trump administration that you mentioned, will those be lifted, or are those going to remain in place? How is the administration going to reconcile the tensions between its commitments to work with them, to work with allies and partners, but also some of the more populist language that you're hearing on reshoring and promoting domestic jobs? And I think they're looking to see, is the U.S. going to pursue any new trade agreements? So these are all questions. I think they're eager to work with the United States. They're quite pleased with the U.S. reaching out. They are pleased to see the U.S. looking to resolve some very thorny, outstanding issues, including with the EU, that I will leave for Thomas to discuss. But they are cooperating on a range of issues and looking to build frameworks. I guess I would say, if there's low-hanging fruit, it is that they built the frameworks under which cooperation will take place. And now the hard work comes of, okay, what does that cooperation entail? Who will it be with, and what will be expected of them?
Okay, Thomas?
Yes, Evelyn, thank you so much. And it's great to be with you and Barbara. And I promise I will disagree with some things later with Barbara, but I think I can echo largely what she said. I'll take a European perspective, but I think the European perspective is perhaps not so different from the Asian perspective. And that is essentially because the challenges that you're asking us about are essentially global. China, COVID, climate, those are, I think, the three big challenges that we see. And the opportunity is to come together as the European Union and the United States to really work together on global challenges based on the common interests that we have, but also on the common values that we have. A lot of our work is going to be driven by those values. We will be looking to bring a human-centered approach to artificial intelligence, for example, or to address forced labor practices in Xinjiang, issues that are not specific to the transatlantic trade relationship, but where the transatlantic relationship can really be the platform for projecting those joint interests and those joint values. And that, of course, has a lot to do with being allies, with being partners. We have moved from being a problem, the European Union, to being a partner again, and that's a great thing. And trade has moved also from essentially being weaponized by the Trump administration for a fairly narrow domestic political agenda to being instrumentalized, let's say now, for a broader global agenda by the Biden administration and by ourselves. We're looking at trade as an enabler, as something that can really contribute to that global agenda through the alliances that we want to build or rebuild, rather. I'll just pick up on the second quick question you had, which was on low-hanging fruit. I just want to be clear that the transatlantic tree doesn't have too much low-hanging fruit. I think that has to do with the fact that whatever was easy has been done. If it was easy, I probably wouldn't even be sitting there. We wouldn't be talking today. We're talking about the relationship of an old couple, which has a lot of things are going really well. But there's always a few issues that are difficult. And the question is how to address those issues, how to rekindle the romance on those issues that are there for a while and that are there for a reason, perhaps because we're picky about our food or we have certain views about privacy. But if I do want to already share a little bit of optimism, I'll put that towards the legacy issues. We're looking at a positive agenda for the future, but we obviously have a lot of legacy issues to deal with, including a 15-plus-year-old dispute on aircraft, and we're very confident that we will be able to put that to bed now as we have all the elements on the table. We have suspended tariffs and we have embarked on a process to work towards a final and full settlement of that particular dispute. I wish I could be equally positive about the other tariffs that are in place. I think from a European perspective, the steel tariffs that you mentioned are certainly easy from our side, in the sense that it's simply about suspending those tariffs and moving on and dealing, of course, with some of the overcapacity issues, which is again a global issue that we have. But I appreciate that that is a harder issue for the US domestically, and we're obviously very keen to work on those. So I think legacy issues first, positive agenda next, and alliances are really the key words to work on these global challenges.
That's very interesting, and well, it's pretty optimistic, I must say, even though you're realistic about the challenges and the availability of low-hanging fruit. I'd like to cover China just a tad more. What do you talked about the overcapacity, and that really was generated by China and its overcapacity. I guess the China we noticed it today is probably different than the China we hoped for when they entered the WTO. So some say that that we could be seeing decoupling, but some others say we may be entering a new age of competitive interdependence. So what do you think about that? This time I'll let Thomas go first.
Well, thanks, Evelyn, and I'll see if Barbara agrees with me on that. But when I hear decoupling from China, it's almost like the concept defunding the police. It's a very popular notion that really masks the real issue, the real debate that we should be having. It's not about decoupling. I think Ambassador Lighthizer on his way out has been rather explicit about it. It's not about decoupling. I don't think that's a realistic notion, but there is a real debate to be had. And that debate obviously needs to bear in mind how interconnected we are, how interdependent we are, and the fact that we can't simply decouple. But we are looking, I think, at two other notions, broadly speaking, that is more about diversification on the one hand, and what some call domestication on the other hand. When we think of supply chains in particular, we want to diversify and not be dependent on certain supply chains specifically. And in some cases, we will need to have a serious look at reshoring, onshoring, nearshoring, whatever term you want to use, to bring back some parts of the supplies, at least, to Europe or to other parts of the world. So this is about resilience. This is, of course, also about diversification more generally. In some cases, this will lead to strategic stockpiling. I know we've spoken a lot in Europe about open strategic autonomy, which is a term that scares a lot of people here in Washington. But I do want to be clear that this is about being clear and intentional about the dependencies that we want want to have. We are dependent, we are interdependent as said, but we don't want to be dependent on certain products, on certain countries, perhaps on certain supply chains. And we need to be very clear about that. So our work, and will come out next week, the European Commission will come out with an industrial policy paper that will look at this question of how can we avoid unwanted strategic dependencies. And I think that's the debate that we'll be having, which will have a bit of both, a bit of diversification and a little bit of domestication, but I don't think decoupling should really be the jargon that we'll be using.
Very interesting.
I would like to disagree with Thomas, but I, you know, if you're going to keep a record, so far we're in agreement. I agree with what he said, and I think that what the EU is doing is very similar to the approach that the US government is taking. But one point I would like to make is that these questions, you know, the government is trying to set policies that will influence what businesses choose to do. But ultimately, it's going to be up to a lot of the businesses to determine whether or not they stay in China or move. And I think what you're seeing from the trade data and from surveys is that, notwithstanding a lot of the tensions that have built up and some of the policies that have been put in place, most of the companies have stayed in China and are not looking to leave. And I think that is likely to be the case for some time, because they're in that market to serve that market, a lot of companies. And what you will see, however, I think, is over time, as a result of some of these policies, companies anticipating measures that are going to be put in place and rethinking their operations. So I think it's not so much of a question of decoupling as resilience, as Thomas said, but also a question of anticipating the direction of policy and positioning themselves so that they aren't hurt as a result of something that gets put in place that they didn't anticipate.
Well, I certainly get a lot of questions about moving operations or parts of operations from China. And so origin becomes a very important question. Talking about supply chains, forced labor has gotten a lot of attention. Obviously, we have a very old law that prohibits the importation of goods made with forced labor, but it was updated to eliminate a competitive need limitation or exception. In the US, CBP is now vigorously enforcing bans on imports made with forced labor in the supply chain, which is not easy to detect for certain products. Do you see this as an area of cooperation, and how so? Maybe I'll ask Barbara to go first on this one.
I mean, I guess I would say that supply chains more generally may be an area of cooperation, and you're seeing that already. I mean, the Biden administration has begun its 100-day review of supply chains on semiconductors and batteries and critical minerals and medical supplies. And they're looking very carefully at a number of questions related to self-sufficiency and reshoring, national security, resiliency, just sort of lessening economic vulnerability. And I think for some of those issues, as Thomas said, there will be work that countries will be doing together to figure out how to make these supply chains more resilient. And I see that the G7 officials have said that they're going to discuss some supply chains at the June summit. So there, on those sets of issues, I think there will be at least some work that's done together, and in some cases quite a bit of work, because we have common interests in making sure that certain supply chains are strong and secure. But in terms of forced labor more specifically, I guess I think that's a potential area for cooperation between the US and the EU, and maybe less so with other countries. As you said, the US has implemented a range of actions on forced labor, both the executive branch and Congress. And forced labor has been excluded from US supply chains by law for many, many years. And in the past couple of years, there have been additional measures that have been put in place on Uyghur forced labor. Last year, the US issued withhold release order on a range of goods, and then a broad withhold release order on all cotton from Xinjiang and tomato products as well. The Congress has been active on forced labor. There's now a Congress reintroduced the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act that would ban all production from Xinjiang unless an importer can prove that the product was not made with forced labor. So there's a number of measures in place. I think the EU has been active on this as well, and I'll let Thomas talk about that. Active for a variety of reasons and moving in the same direction. So I think that this is a potential area for the US and EU, if not to work directly together, at least to learn from what each other's doing. My own view is that it would be beneficial for both countries to work together to have common approaches to this. I think it would be more effective in terms of what we're trying to do regarding forced labor around the world and in particular in China.
Thomas, you were talking about the shared values, so this sort of fits neatly in that. So what do you have?
Absolutely, joint interests, joint shared values. So this is a great area of cooperation, and I was glad that Barbara went first, because the US has indeed a certain experience in dealing with this particular challenge, and it is, as Barbara actually said, an area where we're happy to learn, where we're happy to compare notes and to cooperate. That means we're not necessarily going to do the exact same thing at the exact same time. All of these things are addressed through domestic autonomous instruments, and some of them we will further develop in Europe, as we have announced earlier this year that we will come forward with a sustainable corporate governance approach that will address that question of supply chain management by companies more specifically. So we do not have withhold release orders in Europe. We don't have a customs kind of mechanism in the same way as the CBP, as you mentioned, can address this. So in other words, this is an area where we can learn. This is an area where we can compare notes, where we can cooperate, but we're most certainly working in the same direction on the same issues and the same interests.
Okay, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about something there's a buzz that some say that that the new trade war will be over technology. And so how do you envision Europe and Asia addressing these challenges along with the US? And let's start with Thomas.
Yes, we're at the source of a lot of the tech legislation, and I do believe in some ways, not to reduce it to a slogan, but I do believe that the next trade war is a tech war, or at least a tension in terms of technological superiority and competition around that. As Europeans, we've certainly witnessed that there is an across-the-board rivalry with China here in Washington, and that has almost become the organizing principle of US economic, foreign, and security policies. We've seen that the Trump administration has been clear in saying that economic security equals national security. And I see a lot of elements of that also in Build Back Better, in trying to ensure that there's a strong manufacturing base and a strong domestic economy and infrastructure to support economic prosperity and national defense more generally. So I expect a lot more work in this area, a lot more competition in this area also. But obviously that makes it also an opportunity for like-minded countries to come together. And should I say values again? I mentioned artificial intelligence already. But broadly speaking, technology is an area where we want to come together to set standards that reflect our approach of an open democratic society. And so there's a great potential there. The European Union has made a proposal to the US government and to the Biden administration specifically to create what we call a Trade and Technology Council. And the idea is that we really start looking at the issues at the nexus of trade, technology, and national security, and bring together various agencies, really come with a whole of government approach to look at those joint challenges. From our past work, we've seen that it can be difficult to build bridges between very well developed systems that are very different when we talk about conformity assessment, for example, or technical standards that exist in many areas. But when we have a pretty white sheet of paper in front of us, which is the case for many of the new technologies, it is actually a lot easier, and there's more of an opportunity to come together and to start from scratch and say, okay, how are we going to approach it? That doesn't mean we're going to do everything in the same way, but it does provide opportunity for projecting that same strategy, that same interest, and to find our own ways within our own systems, with full account of the interests of the other side and the trade and interests that there are. So I'm very upbeat about the discussions that we will have on artificial intelligence. We're looking forward to new guidance from the Biden administration next month. On May 17th, we came out with our own proposal for an artificial intelligence regulation in the European Union last week. We are happy to speak about quantum. We want to talk about export controls, supply chain security. So there's a lot of issues to talk about. And I really think we need to come together around the nexus between trade and technology and start setting joint standards there.
Very interesting.
All right, so now we're on question 4, and we're starting to diverge. We're moving in that direction. On this one, I agree with Thomas's general thesis about the need for tech cooperation, and some of that is organized around concerns about China. You saw this, the Strategic Competition Act and the Endless Frontiers Act coming from Congress in the last couple of weeks, which are very focused on strengthening U.S. competitiveness and dealing with concerns related to China. I think, so you're hearing a lot of bipartisan concern in Congress, and you're also seeing very comprehensive policies from the administration. In terms of working with Asians on tech issues, I think so far the focus has been more on working on ways to secure technology, to strengthen technology supply chains and cooperate and have common approaches on issues like investment reviews, export controls, maybe cooperation on standards, research and development, potentially funding of new critical technologies, and even to work together on developing new standards. These are the kinds of things that were discussed in the meeting between President Biden and Prime Minister Suga when he was here for the summit last week, or the week before already. And they announced a partnership where they were going to work on some of the same things as Thomas is talking about, how to protect critical technologies and work together toward common interests. Again, as I said before, these were discussed among the Quad countries, and I expect that they'll be discussed when President Moon comes here from Korea in late May. I think that the challenge with the Asians is to ensure that it is not being portrayed as an anti-China coalition, but efforts to promote our respective competitiveness and the competitiveness of our economies, which involves some of these issues, but the goal is to strengthen competitiveness, not to try to hold China back. And I think that work will be done with the EU and the G7 as well. The one issue I wanted to raise, and where we'll start to see some differences between Thomas and I, is, so there are all these sort of tech security issues and protecting critical technologies. And we're all looking at these in similar ways and thinking about ways to control technology and covering many of the same types of issues. There's a separate set of issues that he's raised here about digital governance and those kinds of issues where there's AI or 5G or 6G or any of the other kind of new and emerging technologies where the US is still beginning to think through how it wants to regulate, or if it wants to regulate any of these technologies in order to have common approaches across not just the United States, but globally. And we have moved relatively slowly on this, in part because we just have a different regulatory approach than the EU. We like to think about these things, and we think that regulation should be light touch. The EU has a different approach, and this sort of underlies many of the bilateral issues that have plagued us over the years. So when the EU announced the AI regulation last week, I think that approach was a very typical EU approach to regulating a new technology or regulating a new issue that may diverge from the way that the US sees this, even if we have the same goals. So ideally, through any kind of tech forum, what we would be doing would be cooperating to think through, if not common approaches, approaches that are interoperable, that allow for trade to continue to flow and not to see the kinds of things that we're worried about seeing through the breakdown in the privacy shield, or things like that, that I think it would be very valuable if this forum also took up those issues, so that both the US and the EU could work together to make sure that the approaches that we're taking can be aligned or at least coherent. And then those can serve as a mechanism to help build out common approaches around the rest of the world.
Okay, I don't know if Thomas, I'll give you a chance if you want to respond.
Well, I'm not sure we're already disagreeing, Barbara, because I was precisely trying to suggest that we don't have to do things in the same way, as long as we do them with the same objective in mind. And the interoperability point that you made was very important in that regard. I mean, of course, we have a certain view, to be clear, about designing guardrails for the digital economy. We have taken the leadership role, whether it is through antitrust or through content moderation, or things that I think the Biden administration is starting to look at right now. And we have taken a lead also with data privacy and data protection through the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, which everybody knows now. And I don't want to suggest that we get everything right, but we do get it. We get the challenge that we are trying to address here, and I think that's what is so important in moving forward. That we try to find a way to address those challenges, and that we do that in a joint approach or with a joint spirit. And that doesn't mean that we have to do everything in the same way, including because of the way we are set up. The US takes a kind of a decentralized approach often, or delegates regulatory measures. We are in some issues, in some areas, a little bit more centralized and perhaps more united as Europe than a lot of Americans think or know about. So I think that's fine. I don't see a problem there. But it's obvious, to be very clear, that there will always be areas where we will have our issues, and we have seen that. You mentioned the privacy shield. We're trying to solve that question now, to make sure that there is a big bridge and a big highway basically between our two systems, that data can move freely and with the sufficient protection that it needs.
Okay, I'm going to move to government procurement. Okay, there's and the use or expansion of the concept of Buy America. So I'll turn to Thomas first to ask you how this might affect the U.S., the transatlantic relationship, and then I'll turn to Barbara.
Well, Europeans like America. We like American products, but we don't like Buy America. And we're not a fan. The land of the free suddenly becomes very less free when you talk about government procurement. And that's something we struggle to understand ourselves as an open society that has a product of regulated integration that the European Union is, that has essentially provided also openness to third countries and third country suppliers to be part of our procurement market, single market, as well as other parts of our single market. So for us, it's clear, like in every other area of trade policy, that we need to be thinking about procurement in terms of open, rules-based trade, and reciprocity is certainly an element there too, including as we want to make sure that we have the best value for money for governments as they consume also products, goods, and services. So Buy America is an issue. It has been an issue for a while. It's an issue. It was an issue in the so-called TTIP negotiations, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership negotiations that are now officially in the freezer, and it was one of the main issues why we were stuck in that negotiation. We have been following the announcements from the Biden administration. In the first week, there was already a sort of a Buy America Day. We still need to see what that means. Today, we have a Made in America director that was announced, Celeste Drake, and we know Celeste well. We look forward to working with her to essentially find the fine balance between of course, supporting industry and our innovation and our competitiveness, but do that, of course, in a fair way, in a way that also allows foreign suppliers to compete in a very fair manner. That's the approach that we take. I should maybe add one positive point, that we were very happy to see that the Biden administration did not pursue the withdrawal of certain commitments in the WTO Government Procurement Agreement, GPA. I think that's a very positive sign, and that's precisely supporting sort of our key goal, which is to have predictable rules and fair rules in this area, like in any other area of trade policy. So we're certainly on guard. We're certainly watching this very, very closely with some concern, but I hope we can engage and we can get this one right too.
Well, Barbara, you are a former U.S. trade negotiator, and maybe you can give us the U.S. perspective, but also how this is received in Asia as well.
Yeah. Well, first I say there's a lot of pressure on the administration on this issue, and I think, as Thomas said, the Biden administration announced in its first week that it was going, there was an EO on Buy America that strengthened many of the provisions in Buy America, and the administration has been intent on going forward with that, as the announcement today of the new Made in America that the person would be was put out. In terms of the Asians, I think they're watching closely as the Europeans are. It's probably a less significant issue for some countries in Asia than it is for others. Among the countries that care a lot about this issue in Asia are, the members of the GPA, of the WTO government procurement from Asia are few. So it would be Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. So, a certain set of countries. I think for those countries, they'll care to varying degrees about what the US is doing. Many of the other countries in Asia have argued for a long time against inclusion of government procurement in trade agreements. And for many years, in many agreements that we've negotiated, it's been a very contentious issue because the US had been a strong supporter of inclusion of government procurement commitments in trade agreements. And these countries were opposing it. I'm not sure where this administration would be on that issue if they do negotiate any free trade agreements. In RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, there was actually a chapter on government procurement, but it didn't include any market access commitments, no commitments to open the procurement markets, just commitments on transparency and cooperation, and those were not even subject to dispute settlement anyway. So there's differing views across Asia, but for those Asians that are part of the government procurement agreement or have FTAs with us that have market access as a result, I think they're watching the Buy American moves from this administration very carefully. I think it sort of comes back to one of the questions that I raised at the beginning of the administration looking to support domestic jobs and build back the economy and trade for the middle class and those kinds of objectives versus working with allies and partners. And the government procurement agreement is actually, if you look at all the members of that agreement, it is largely a group of like-minded countries. So when we take actions there, it is going against, it is somewhat in conflict with some of the broader goals that the US has about working with allies and partners. I agree with Thomas that it was very interesting in terms of this kind of tension that they have between working with allies and partners and promoting jobs in the United States. It was interesting to see that the administration decided to discontinue its efforts to exclude essential medicines from the WTO government procurement coverage. So last year the United States put forward a notification saying, because of COVID, and we're gonna withdraw our coverage of essential medicines. We no longer want it to be covered. They in fact did not offer countries any compensation for that adjustment. So most of the countries that were affected decided that they were going to launch arbitration or go to arbitration with the United States. And it wasn't clear the way that this was really going to play out. And the United States did in the end decide to withdraw this notification to avoid the potential retaliation. But what was interesting about it was that when it announced that it was withdrawing the notification, what it said was they wanted to find ways to secure medical supply chains with allies and partners. In other words, they thought that they could deal with this issue through working with allies and partners on medical supply chains cooperatively, and then they therefore no longer needed to do this. So I thought that that was actually a very good outcome to this situation. And for those Asians that care about this issue and were watching, they were probably very pleased to see that. And hopefully we will find ways to do that in other areas as well.
I want to get two more questions in. One of them is about the World Trade Organization. The organization, the WTO, is not in real good shape. The U.S. has blocked appointments to the appellate body, and it's been crippled. But on the other hand, it has a new director general. And the question for you all is, what do you think the future will hold for the WTO? Do you think the Biden administration will be more supportive of it and work towards much needed reform? And let's go with Thomas. So coin toss. Okay.
Thank you. I'll give Barbara a quick break there. But just to say that the WTO is one of our biggest priorities, of course. Multilateral rules-based trade is so important. And we've been very clear in Europe that the WTO needs to be made relevant again. It needs to be modernized. We need a reform effort. That means we need modern rules, market access that really responds to today's challenges. But we also need to strengthen and sharpen what is so unique about that organization, which is its teeth, really, the idea that it has binding, enforceable dispute settlement. That is so important. And there have been many problems. We've been quite explicit ourselves. We've joined the US in certain views about the problems we see with at least the second step of that binding dispute settlement. But for us, it's important that when it's broken, let's fix it and let's address the issues at its core. We didn't see in Ambassador Lighthizer someone that was talking very much about solutions. He was talking a lot about the problems, and I think he's been very clear about that. And we've heard him, and I should add that this is not a unique position to the previous administration. We've heard it from others before, but we really need to get on with it, and we really need to modernize the WTO and make sure that it has an effective negotiating pillar, an effective litigation pillar also. And as we negotiate better rules, we hope we need less adjudication and less dispute settlement more generally. So we have a unique opportunity with a new director general, as you said, Dr. Okonjo-Iweala. We have a new administration, and we are in the year of a ministerial conference, the 12th ministerial conference later this year in November in Geneva. So we hope we can prioritize this effort in delivering new rules in areas like e-commerce and fish subsidies, while working on a binding two-step dispute settlement process again.
Barbara, any hope?
I guess I agree with what Thomas said about the priority. Going back to your question, will the Biden administration, is it going to be supportive? Well, certainly more supportive than the Trump administration. So if you take that as the baseline, then they are going to be more supportive. They supported the consensus on naming a new director general very quickly, which I think people saw as a positive sign. But so far, no Geneva deputy has been announced out of USTR, so we don't have a good sense of what that person's priorities would be. And I guess what I would say from how it appears right now, I started at the beginning talking about the Biden administration's priorities, and this was not on the list. Trade or WTO reform was not on the list. I think many of the other issues will take priority. Mm-hmm. This will be somewhere on the list, but much farther down on the list. Whether progress can be made on fisheries or e-commerce negotiations in time for something to be delivered before the ministerial conference later this year, I think remains to be seen. I think the administration would like to look at WTO reform, but I don't think that there's been a lot of thinking yet on what those proposals will be. And there are big questions about what the approach will be from this administration and how they're going to think about questions like MFN or broader reforms covering state capitalism and other issues like that, that I think will need to be part of whatever kind of reform goes forward. So I expect them to move it, but it may be slower than some people would like to see.
Okay, this has been in the news quite a bit, and today in the Post and the New York Times, they've been reporting on the terrible situation in India with the pandemic. Last year, both India and South Africa asked for a waiver from the WTO rules on intellectual property called TRIPS. Many countries support this request, yet many developed countries, including the US, still maintain their opposition. And I guess the editorials have been critical of Biden for not addressing this since he promised during the campaign international cooperation in the fight against COVID. So let me ask Barbara, since what do you think about how this might play out with this new administration?
Well, I think this is obviously an important issue and one on which the administration is putting a lot of attention. You know, they clearly want to get as many people vaccinated around the world as quickly as they can, and there are international efforts already underway on this. I think in terms of the debate in the WTO and the TRIPS waiver, as you said, India and South Africa have led the effort to get the waiver. And this is like a full TRIPS waiver, not just compulsory licensing or something to do with patents. It's a full TRIPS waiver. The US, EU, Japan, Switzerland have opposed, and I think countries seem to want to find some sort of compromise. The US hasn't said exactly what it's going to do. You've heard USTR Catherine Tai sort of hint that they'd like to find some way through this, but there haven't been any specific proposals forthcoming, and there is a lot of pressure on the administration, as you said, from both sides. I guess for me, when I look at it now, I think it's not clear to me what impact a TRIPS waiver would have at this point, and in any case, why you need a waiver from the entire TRIPS agreement. You have a number of companies that have said they're either not going to enforce their patents or they are going to voluntarily license their production. You had Moderna, today you had Gilead and Merck talking about voluntary licensing, aid, provision of equipment. So I think you have some of that going on. But the real question is timing. Even if you were to have something like a TRIPS waiver right now, by the time those vaccines were developed, it seems as though we would be in a period when there will be surplus vaccines in the United States and likely actually additional new vaccines that aren't even yet in the market. So the question may be more, how do countries cooperate on distribution and promotion of production where there is capacity for additional production, than the necessity for a TRIPS waiver to accomplish what needs to be done.
Thomas, do you have any comments?
Yeah, no, I'm on a very similar tune there. Obviously, we need to look very, very seriously at COVID crisis in general. We don't want to leave any stone unturned in terms of the contribution that trade policy can make, but we also need to be clear. We want to have an effective solution to a very real problem. And I think that's the issue. A TRIPS waiver doesn't appear to be a solution to the problem of vaccine availability, in our view. Producing vaccines is highly complex. If we just look at the issues we've had in Europe or here in the United States, in Baltimore, we're both trying to boost our capacity, and that's been difficult. So thinking that we can now sort of flip a switch around the world and have suddenly vaccines produced everywhere, that's simply not how it works, unfortunately. So handing out patent rights is not necessarily going to lead to an increase of those production efforts, and we're very supportive as the EU of the efforts of the WTO Director General, who is indeed looking to find the so-called third way as we try to support manufacturing around the world. I should maybe add that the European Union is the largest producer and the largest exporter of vaccines. We're exporting vaccines around the world, including through the so-called COVAX initiative. So I think that really speaks to our commitment to make vaccines available, to make sure that they're affordable also. But we're not sure, we don't see how a TRIPS waiver can really help us to achieve that. I think we should rather focus our efforts on something that is more productive than on the patent discussion.
I did promise to open this up for Q&A, and I'm trying to see what the questions are. There is a question about e-commerce. You did touch on that before. So the person is asking whether you all think that there is an appetite on the part of the USTR to make progress on the joint statement initiative on e-commerce. He says that, or he says that this is of critical importance to global business, and there's a concern that the U.S. has not given this sufficient attention. Well, Barbara, do you have any thoughts on that?
I do think that the U.S. is supportive of trying to conclude the agreement. There are issues that are they're difficult issues in that negotiation that countries have yet to overcome. There are differences of views on the standards of the agreement and the specific language, but I don't think it's for lack of interest on the part of the U.S. I think it's just ensuring that the outcome of the agreement reflects what the U.S. believes should be the standard that comes out of a WTO agreement.
Okay, I guess it's mostly a U.S. question, but Thomas, do you have any?
No, hard to speak for the US, of course. I won't do that, but I can only repeat that we are most interested in precisely modernizing the rulebook of the WTO, and the e-commerce joint statement initiative is very much a part of that effort. It's one of the deliverables we see for MC12, the 12th Ministerial Conference later this year. So we hope USTR comes out and joins again that effort to push this over the finish line. So I think it's one of the clear priorities as far as we're concerned.
Yeah, we have a question on forced labor, but I think we've covered that, so I think we're pretty good on that one. There's another question on it talks about the TTIP and the U.S. withdrawal from TPP. They state that there's been limited progress in recent years, some feedback in establishing binding rules for data transfers, which they say is essential for both digital and traditional economies. The question is this: what are the prospects for progress in this area, both on the transatlantic and trans-Pacific areas in the near future? So it's really about binding rules for data transfers.
I'm sorry, there was a lot of feedback. There
was a lot of feedback, I'm sorry. The question is about binding rules for data transfers, which what are the prospects for progress in this area, both in the transatlantic and the trans-Pacific regions?
I mean, if you're talking about the I'll let Thomas talk about the state of that negotiation, but it seems as though both parties have committed to try to move that negotiation to conclusion. With regard to the Pacific countries, I mean, you have cross-border privacy rules under APEC that allow transfer of data, and I think that that's the direction that countries that are party to APEC would like to pursue.
This is really, I think, about digital trade, right? Data flows.
Well, I could maybe just quickly say that this is indeed an issue that is addressed in the transatlantic context in the so-called Privacy Shield. We have received last year another judgment from our court that had certain concerns with the Privacy Shield, and we're working our way through them now. we'll have a second round of talks at the end of this week with the Commerce Department to try and address those issues. So our objective is very clear. We want a privacy shield. We want basically that highway that allows for simple but also safe transfer of data between the European Union and the United States. And for that, we just need to make sure that we have a legal framework that responds to the needs that our court has identified. Of course, that needs to respect also the rules we have back in Europe. So there's a very strong commitment to move that conversation forward, but it's of course not a very simple one.
We do have a question on investor state ISDS, investor state dispute resolution. And the question is, could we see the US seeking a global reservation on ISDS before joining something like CPTPP? Barbara, can you they did that in USMCA, of course, so maybe you want to chime in.
Well, first, I'd like to see the U.S. seek to rejoin TPP, and then we can talk about what it does with ISDS. I don't think that the U.S. would necessarily, there's no particular means to provide a global reservation. I mean, the issue may come up in renewal of Trade Promotion Authority, where Congress may weigh in on this issue. But in terms of what the administration would do, it would only come up in the context of pursuing a new trade negotiation that would include investment commitments, which they are not at the moment looking to do. Were they to do that, I think this administration may take an approach similar to that was included in USMCA, as you said, which excluded investor state dispute settlement. I think that would be an issue on which Congress will have a view. The administration will have a view, but I don't think that if the US were to go back to TPP, this would be one among a long list of issues that it would want to review and update before it came back to the table.
Okay, so you're not very optimistic about the US rejoining CPTPP?
Not in the near term, anyway.
Do you think do you see a path?
I mean, I think the administration has been clear that it is not looking to negotiate any trade agreements until it gets the domestic house in order. There are many who would like to see the United States come back to TPP or to negotiate some sort of comprehensive agreement with countries in the region. I know a lot of the Asian countries are very eager to have the United States back in the mix. And right now there's the CPTPP and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that was concluded last year, two different trade architectures in Asia. And the United States is not in either of them at this point. So I think other countries would like to see the United States back in. There are many in the United States that feel that the United States withdrawal from TPP was a strategic blunder and that the US should come back in. But that just doesn't seem to be something that the administration is considering right now. Is there a path forward? Some people have suggested that the path forward is to start with sectoral agreements like a digital trade agreement with Asia Pacific countries and build from there, or to start with a smaller group of countries and build out from there. My own view is that any of these things are extremely time consuming. If you negotiate a digital agreement and then you build it out, and then you have to figure out how it's linked with the other agreements that you negotiate, that takes time. If you negotiate smaller agreements and then you want to open them up, that takes time. And that was one of the reasons why in the end with TPP, we just decided we will do a comprehensive agreement that includes as many countries as possible so that we could get the benefits of both the comprehensiveness of the agreement, but also the geographic diversity and size. That at this point, I just don't think the administration has begun to contemplate whether it wants to do this, and if so, how. Should they get to that point, there are many of us that have ideas of how they could do that.
Okay, I think we're out of time. Are we out of time, Juliana? So can I let them give a final word? Thomas, do you have a final word or anything you want to say?
Final word is that as America is back, we're hoping, of course, that the transatlantic relationship is back, that we're partners again, and that we can really start working on those global challenges, which are many, and I think a joint approach is needed. So that, I think, is what we're doing. We're moving now to work on a positive agenda and put to bed those legacy issues. So that's really what is keeping me busy. And I hope that there will be more news as an EU-US leaders summit was announced, as President Biden will make his first foreign trip to the UK and Belgium on 14th of June.
Barbara, final word. Yeah, I think that the administration has gotten off to a good start, and as I said, set very clear priorities that it's moving toward fulfilling. There are challenging issues ahead, but I'm optimistic that given the start that they've made, that they will be able to continue making progress.
Well, thank you very, very much. And thank you, Juliana, for giving us this opportunity to speak to your members.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the panelists and to all attendees. If you miss some parts, the recording will be there, and join us for future program. Thanks. Bye.